I'm Joanne Thompson, a trustee of the charity Buckingham Old Gaol Trust, which looks after the Grade 2 star listed Old Gaol Museum. We are the English home of Flora Thompson, the celebrated local author who wrote the trilogy Lark Rise to Candleford. This short talk discusses some of the real people and places that she used in her books. It is produced from books about Flora, written by Christine Bloxham, Gillian Lindsay and Martin Greenwood, and it also includes quotes from her own books. Although all three of her books, Lark Rise, Over to Candleford and Candleford Green, were published as autobiographical, they were in fact only based on her childhood and life as a young woman, and she combined many places and people to write a fascinating insight to rural life at the end of the 19th century. The books were first published during World War II, so must have been delightfully nostalgic when the British public needed such memories. Since that time, many researchers, historians and authors have been on the trail of the real Lark Rise to Candleford. Lark Rise was her childhood home of Juniper Hill. The book starts with a description. The hamlet stood on a gentle rise in the flat, wheat-growing northeast corner of Oxfordshire. We will call it Lark Rise because of the great number of skylarks which made the surrounding fields their springboard and nested on the bare earth between the rows of green corn. In the books, Flora describes going to school and attending church in a place she calls Fordlow. The real school and church are in fact Cottisford. She wrote, Fordlow might boast of its church, its school, its annual concert and its quarterly penny reading, but the hamlet did not envy it for these amenities, for it had its own centre, warmer, more human and altogether preferable in the tap room of the waggon and horses. Albert and Emma Timms, Flora's parents, married on the 29th of July 1875 in Cottisford Church when Albert was aged 21. Flora was born 18 months later. It was smaller than Juniper Hill with a different character, as Eton College owned much of the land. The church was built in the 13th century and Flora and her brother Edwin sat in a pew halfway down the nave. It now has a commemorative plaque dedicated to Flora and Edwin is commemorated on the brass wall memorial. The Reverend Harrison, Mr. Ellison in the book, taught scripture at their school and his daughter visited the hamlet families and was friendly with Flora's mother. Flora stayed a year longer than most of the other pupils and helped teach. Flora would have studied reading, writing, arithmetic and needlework, a very basic education for someone who was to become a writer. The second book in the series, Over to Candleford, Flora describes Candleford as a wonderful place. Her mother said there were rows of shops there, simply stuffed with toys and sweets and furs and muffs and watches and chains and other delightful things. A letter from 1944, written by Flora and published by Martin Greenwood in his book The Real Candleford Green, explains how autobiographical the books were. Flora wrote, Lark Rise, as far as I could make it, a faithful portrait of the little Oxfordshire hamlet where I spent my childhood. In Candleford and Candleford Green, I wrote more freely, intending to give rather a picture of country life at that time and to portray some of the country characters I had known, rather than describe any particular town. There is something both of Banbury and Bicester and more of Buckingham in my picture of Candleford. It was actually to Buckingham we went in the spring cart and some of my relatives lived there. In fact, her father was born in Buckingham, so she would have travelled regularly to visit her grandparents in the town. She shopped in Brackley, where her father worked, and Banbury was mentioned in its real name in her book Still Glides the Stream. She makes reference to Banbury cakes in Candleford Green when she has her first tea at the post office. Banbury also had a mechanics institute to borrow books similar to Candleford, but a first description of Candleford could easily apply to Bicester. Candleford became for several years her second home. She writes about Laura. Every afternoon, when her cousins could be persuaded to go out or do what they wanted to do without her, she would tap on the door of her uncle's workshop and hear the familiar challenge, Who goes there? And reply, Bookworms Limited, and receiving the password, go in and sit by the open window, looking out on the garden and river and read while her uncle worked. Her real uncle, Thomas Whiting, was a shoemaker who lived in Twyford. He loved books which Flora borrowed when visiting. In fact, after leaving her first post office job, it is thought that she worked in Twyford post office. Flora wrote in her book, "In the early spring, a letter came from Candleford saying that Dorcas Lane wanted a learner for her post office work and thought Laura would do, if her parents were willing. Although she was not one for much gadding about, she said it was irksome to be always tied to the house during post office hours. Not that I expect her to stay with me forever," she added. "She'll want to do better for herself later on, and when that time comes I'll speak to head office and we shall see what we shall see." So in the third book, Candleford Green, which is in fact Fringford, Flora starts work. The post office and blacksmith were owned by a family friend called Kezia Whitton, the real Dorcas Lane. Despite losing her husband, Kezia continued running the post office and blacksmiths, which wasn't usual for that time. Flora writes in the book, "Attached to the smithy was a long, low white house, which might have been taken for an ordinary cottage of the more substantial kind, but for a scarlet-painted letterbox let into the wall beneath a window at one end. Over the window was a painted board, which informed the public that the building was Candleford Green Post and Telegraph Office. At the other end of the building, above the door of the smithy, was another board, which read, Dorcas Lane, Shoeing and General Smith." The real post office had a prominent position near the village green in Fringford, but there was no telegraph machine when she arrived. Although Flora changed the name and physical characteristics of Kezia, she still portrayed her with her sharp intellect. The Old Gaol Museum has a letter written by Flora's sister, in which it says, "I'm pleased to give you the information you require. In the first place, Candleford Green is Fringford, where my sister started her work in the post office, with the old blacksmith shop at the side. It is still there, but not used now. It is not the blacksmith shop on the corner you pass to get to the main road to Buckingham, but further up the village, and Buckingham is only a few miles from there, so is included in the name Candleford Green. And that is where we visited our cousins, and one family of cousins, the Whitings, lived at Twyford, Bucks, and was the families of my father's two sisters. So we're all included in the book, but most of it is about Fringford." In 1897, Flora gave notice to leave the post office, as she wanted to explore further away from home. After Kezia's death in 1898, the post office was moved to Rectory Lane. Flora wrote, "Laura's sojourn at Candleford Green was to be but of a few years' duration, and if the choice had been hers and she had remained there, her life might not have been as happy and peaceful as she afterwards imagined it would have been. Her mother's judgment was usually sound, and she had often told her, 'You're not cut out for a pleasant, easy life. You think too much,' sometimes adding tolerantly, 'But we are as we are made, I suppose.' So although she left the countryside of Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, she did not leave her memories of the people and places of her childhood and early adulthood. As a letter carrier, she was able to explore this countryside, and she developed her lifelong love of nature, which shows throughout her writings. Thank you for listening. We hope to see you at the museum soon."